A blind horse was abandoned, condemned to a life without a future, until a girl appeared, changing everything with courage and determination. The journey that followed proves that the impossible can be overcome. The morning frost painted delicate patterns on the windows of McAllister Stables, one of Kentucky's most prestigious horse breeding facilities. Inside the main stable, Richard McAllister stood tall, his steel-gray eyes scanning the immaculate surroundings he had built over 3 decades. Every trophy, every ribbon, and every photograph on the walls told a story of triumph, of championships won and records broken. But for Richard, it was never enough. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. The stable hands moved with practiced efficiency, their movements precise and calculated, just as he had trained them. They knew that in Richard McAllister's world there was no room for mistakes. His reputation for breeding champion thoroughbreds had made him both respected and feared throughout the equestrian community. "Mr. McAllister," called Dr. Thompson, the stable's veterinarian, her voice echoing through the corridor. "Starlight Grace has gone into labor." Richard's pulse quickened. Starlight Grace was his crown jewel, a mare that had won every major race she had entered. This foal, bred from his finest stallion, was meant to be his masterpiece, the culmination of years of careful breeding and selection. The birthing stable was a flurry of activity. Stable hands moved quietly but purposefully, preparing everything under Dr. Thompson's direction. Richard watched from the corner, his presence casting a shadow over the proceedings. The air was thick with anticipation as Starlight Grace's labor progressed. Hours passed, and finally, the foal arrived. The stable fell silent as Dr. Thompson conducted her initial examination. Richard stepped forward, expecting to hear about his newest champion. Instead, he saw something in the vet's expression that made his blood run cold. "Mr. McAllister," Dr. Thompson began carefully, "the foal appears to be healthy in every way, but—" She hesitated, knowing the weight her next words would carry. "The foal is blind." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face remained impassive, but those who knew him well could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. This wasn't just a setback, it was an affront to everything the McAllister name stood for. Among the stable hands, young Ethan Carter watched the scene unfold with growing unease. He had only been working at McAllister Stables for 6 months, but he had already learned that Richard McAllister's reactions to disappointment could be severe. The foal, unaware of the judgment being passed upon it, struggled to its feet, its movements uncertain but determined. "Dr. Thompson," Richard's voice cut through the tension like a knife, "prepare your final report." "Ethan," he turned to the young stable hand, "my office now." As Ethan followed Richard through the stable's polished corridors, his mind raced. The morning sun streaming through the windows did nothing to warm the chill that had settled over him. The other stable hands avoided eye contact as they passed, their faces a mixture of pity and relief that they weren't in his position. Richard's office was a testament to his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the training grounds, where horses worth millions grazed in perfectly maintained paddocks. Awards and photographs covered the walls, each one a reminder of the standard Richard McAllister demanded. "Ethan," Richard began, his voice unnaturally calm as he settled behind his massive oak desk. "You've shown promise in your time here. You understand discretion, don't you?" Ethan nodded, his throat too dry to speak. "Good." Richard pulled out a map from his desk drawer, spreading it across the polished surface. "There's a forest, about 5 miles from here, remote, isolated." His finger traced a path on the map. "You will take the foal there tonight. Leave it. Return immediately." This conversation never happened. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. The implication of what Richard was asking him to do made him feel sick, but he knew that refusing wasn't an option. Not if he wanted to keep his job, not if he wanted to have any future in the industry. "Do you understand?" Richard's voice carried the weight of command, leaving no room for discussion. "Yes, sir," Ethan managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good." Richard turned to look out the window, effectively dismissing him. "Remember, Ethan, in this business, perfection isn't just a goal. It's the only acceptable standard." As Ethan left the office, his steps echoing in the empty corridor, He couldn't shake the image of the newborn foal still struggling to find its feet in a world it would never see. He had until nightfall to figure out how to live with what he was about to do, knowing that sometimes the price of ambition was paid in pieces of one's soul. The winter wind howled through the trees as Ethan led the trailer down the narrow forest road. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating swirling snowflakes that seemed to dance in the beam. In the trailer behind him, the blind foal shifted restlessly, its movements making Ethan's heart heavier with each passing mile. He had waited until well past midnight, when the stable was empty except for the night watchman, who had been instructed not to ask questions. The foal had gone quietly into the trailer, trusting in a way that made this betrayal even more painful. Now, as Ethan drove deeper into the forest, following Richard McAllister's carefully marked map, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would haunt him forever. Meanwhile, in a modest house at the edge of the forest, 12-year-old Emma Carter sat at her window, unable to sleep. The storm outside matched her restless mood. Her mother, Rachel, had been working double shifts at the local diner, trying to make ends meet since Emma's father had left them 3 years ago. Emma often stayed up late on nights like this, waiting for her mother to return home. The girls' room was a testament to her love of horses. Drawings covered the walls, some torn from magazines, others created by her own hand. She had never been able to afford riding lessons, but that hadn't stopped her from dreaming. Every book on her shelf was about horses, and she had read each one countless times. A movement in the darkness caught her attention. Through the swirling snow, she saw headlights moving along the old forest road. Strange, she thought, nobody ever used that road, especially not at this hour. The light stopped at the edge of the trees, and Emma pressed her face against the cold glass, curiosity overwhelming her usual caution. Back in the forest, Ethan had reached the spot Richard had designated. His hands shook as he opened the trailer door. The foal nickered softly, sensing his presence. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, the reality of what he was about to do crushing him. The foal was beautiful, despite its disability, or perhaps because of it. Its coat was the color of starlight, just like its mother's, and even its sightless eyes held a kind of wisdom that seemed beyond its few hours of life. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, leading the foal out of the trailer. "I'm so sorry." His voice cracked as he removed the halter, his last connection to the innocent creature. The foal stood confused, sensing the vastness of the forest around it. Ethan knew he should leave quickly, make a clean break, but his feet wouldn't move. Emma had pulled on her warmest coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped out of the house. Something about those mysterious lights had called to her, and she had always trusted her instincts. The snow crunched under her feet as she made her way toward the forest edge, her flashlight beam bobbing in the darkness. The sound of an engine starting made her freeze. Through the trees, she saw taillights moving away, leaving something behind. As the vehicle disappeared into the night, Emma heard it, a soft, frightened sound that made her heart skip a beat. She moved forward carefully, her flashlight beam finally falling on a sight that took her breath away. There, standing alone in the snow, was the most beautiful foal she had ever seen. Its coat seemed to shimmer in the flashlight's beam, but something was wrong. The foal didn't react to the light, didn't turn to look at her approach. As Emma drew closer, she realized why. "Oh," she breathed, her heart filling with a mixture of wonder and anger. Who could abandon a blind foal in the middle of a winter night? The foal's ears pricked at the sound of her voice, and it turned toward her, seeking connection in its darkness. Emma knew she had to act quickly. The temperature was dropping, and the foal wouldn't survive long in these conditions. But how could she, a 12-year-old girl, move a horse? Her mind raced, remembering everything she had read about handling horses. She had no rope, no halter, nothing but her voice and her determination. "Hey, beautiful," she said softly, moving closer. "I'm going to help you, I promise." The foal trembled but didn't move away as Emma reached out to touch its neck. Its coat was soft under her mittened hand, and she could feel its warmth, its life. In that moment, Emma made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her. She knew her mother would be home soon, and she had to act fast. With gentle words and careful movements, Emma began the challenging task of guiding a blind foal through the snowy forest to her home. She couldn't know that her actions that night would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the powerful Richard McAllister and prove that sometimes the greatest strength comes from what others see as weakness. Rachel Carter's exhaustion from her double shift at the diner vanished the moment she pulled into her driveway. There, in the soft glow of the porch light, stood her daughter Emma next to what appeared to be a horse. Not just any horse, a foal that couldn't have been more than a day old. "Emma Catherine Carter," Rachel's voice carried across the yard, a mixture of disbelief and concern. "What in heaven's name is going on here?" Emma stood her ground, one hand protectively on the foal's neck. "Mom, I can explain. Someone abandoned him in the forest. He's blind and he would have frozen out there." Her voice cracked with emotion. "We have to help him." Rachel moved closer, her footsteps crunching in the snow. The foal's ears twitched at the sound, but it remained still, as if sensing Emma's protective presence. In the porch light, Rachel could see the animal's exceptional breeding. This was no ordinary farm horse. "Sweetheart," Rachel began, trying to keep her voice steady, "we can barely afford to feed ourselves a horse." She shook her head, the impossibility of the situation weighing heavily on her shoulders. "His name is Bright," Emma announced suddenly, her chin lifted in determination. "Because I can see light in his eyes, even if he can't see with them. Please, Mom. We can figure something out. We have to." Rachel looked at her daughter, recognizing the same stubborn determination she herself had needed when Emma's father had walked out on them. The foal nickered softly, and Rachel noticed how it leaned slightly toward Emma, already trusting her. "Just for tonight," Rachel conceded, knowing she'd probably regret it. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." Emma's face lit up with hope. "The Johnsons' old barn," she said quickly, having clearly thought this through. "Mr. Johnson said we could use it any time, and it's just sitting empty." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. They cleaned out a corner of the old barn, laid down fresh straw Emma found in the loft, and rigged up some old horse blankets as makeshift walls to block the draft. Rachel watched in amazement as her daughter worked tirelessly, showing a focus and dedication she'd never seen before. By dawn, Emma had already developed a system. She tied small bells at different heights around the barn, creating sound markers that helped Bright navigate his new space. Her voice became his anchor, constant and reassuring. Rachel found herself watching from the barn door as Emma read aloud from her horse books, explaining everything to Bright, as if he could understand every word. "See, Mum?" Emma said excitedly, demonstrating how Bright had already learned to follow the sound of her footsteps. "He's so smart. And look at this." She jingled one of the bells, and Bright turned precisely in its direction. Rachel couldn't help but smile, even as worry gnawed at her stomach. Feed costs, veterinary care, proper equipment. The list of expenses seemed endless. But there was something special happening here, something that went beyond practical concerns. Word spread quickly in their small community. Some neighbors brought hay, others offered old equipment they no longer needed. Emma meticulously documented everything in a notebook, creating a schedule for Bright's care that worked around her school hours and her mother's shifts at the diner. The local veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Martinez, heard about Bright and offered to examine him at a reduced fee. "In all my years," she said, watching Emma guide Bright through some basic exercises, "I've never seen anything quite like this. The bond between them is extraordinary, but not everyone was supportive. Some locals whispered that keeping a blind horse was cruel, that it should have been put down. Emma heard the whispers at school, but they only strengthened her resolve. She spent every free moment with Bright, developing innovative ways to train him. Using a series of verbal commands and bell combinations, Emma created a language that Bright understood perfectly. She walked with him for hours, helping him memorize every step of his surroundings. The once awkward foal began moving with surprising grace, his other senses compensating for his lack of sight. Rachel watched her daughter blossom, transforming from a quiet, somewhat withdrawn child into a confident young girl with a purpose. The financial strain was still there, but seeing Emma's dedication made every sacrifice worth it. They may not have had much, but they had each other, and now they had Bright. What they didn't know was that back at McAllister Stables, Richard was facing his own challenges. His prized breeding program had hit an unexpected rough patch, with several promising horses failing to perform as expected. The whispers of a blind horse being trained by a young girl hadn't reached him yet, But fate had a way of bringing things full circle, and their paths were destined to cross sooner than anyone could imagine. Spring arrived in Kentucky with a burst of color and warmth, bringing new life to the countryside. At the modest Carter barn, Emma stood watching Bright as he moved confidently through an obstacle course she had created. The once fragile foal had grown into a strong young horse, his silver coat gleaming in the morning sun. The bells she had carefully placed throughout the course chimed softly in the breeze, creating a symphony that Bright had learned to navigate with remarkable precision. "That's it, boy," Emma encouraged, as Bright successfully maneuvered around a barrel, responding to the subtle sound cues she had spent months teaching him. Her innovation had surprised everyone. She had developed a complex system of verbal commands and sound signals that allowed Bright to move with the confidence of a sighted horse. Meanwhile, at McAllister Stables, Richard sat in his office, staring at the latest competition results with growing concern. His newest crop of horses wasn't performing as expected. Thunder's Legacy, his most promising stallion, had come in fourth in the Kentucky Spring Classic, a result that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. "Mr. McAllister," his assistant interrupted his brooding. "The reporters from Horse and Hound are here for the interview." Richard straightened his tie, pushing aside the disappointing results. The interview had been scheduled months ago, meant to be a celebration of his continued dominance in the industry. Now it felt more like an interrogation waiting to happen. Back at the Carter property, Emma was introducing a new element to Bright's training. She had noticed how he responded to vibrations in the ground and had begun experimenting with different rhythmic patterns to guide his movements. The local children had started coming by to watch, fascinated by the unique partnership between the girl and her blind horse. "Emma," Rachel called from the barn entrance, holding up an envelope. It came. The application for the Rising Stars Youth Equestrian Showcase. Emma's heart raced as she took the envelope. The showcase was a regional event that highlighted young riders and their horses. It wasn't a formal competition, but it was an opportunity to demonstrate what she and Bright had accomplished. The entry fee had seemed impossible at first, but the local community had rallied around them, organizing bake sales and car washes to raise the money. "Do you really think we're ready?" Emma asked, more to Bright than to her mother. The horse nickered softly, pressing his nose against her shoulder in what had become their special gesture of encouragement. Rachel watched her daughter with pride. "You've done something extraordinary here, Emma. People need to see this." As Emma began filling out the application, Richard McAllister was facing the press with his usual polished charm, but the questions were becoming harder to deflect. "Mr. McAllister, your stable has seen an unusual string of setbacks this season. Some are suggesting that the McAllister magic might be fading. How do you respond to that?" Richard's smile remained fixed, but his knuckles whitened around his pen. "In this business, excellence is a journey, not a destination. McAllister Stables continues to set the standard for breeding excellence." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. After the reporters left, Richard called in his team for an emergency meeting. The stakes were getting higher. Major investors were starting to ask questions, and he couldn't afford any more setbacks. As spring turned to early summer, word began to spread about the blind horse and the young girl who had taught him to navigate the world through sound and touch. Local papers ran small features, and videos started appearing on social media. Emma, focused entirely on preparing for the showcase, remained unaware of the growing attention. Dr. Martinez had become a regular visitor, documenting Bright's progress for a paper she planned to write about alternative training methods for disabled horses. "What you've done here," she told Emma one afternoon, "could change how we think about working with special needs animals." The showcase was scheduled for the end of June, and Emma spent every free moment preparing. She had choreographed a routine that would demonstrate not just Bright's ability to navigate obstacles, but the deep connection between horse and rider. The local seamstress had donated her time to create a special outfit for Emma, and the community pitched in to have Bright's tack professionally cleaned and repaired. What no one knew was that the Rising Stars Showcase had caught the attention of several prominent figures in the equestrian world, including some of Richard McAllister's most important clients. They were intrigued by the rumors of a blind horse performing complex maneuvers, seeing it as a novelty that might provide some entertainment between these serious performances. As Emma practiced late into the evening, the sun setting behind the Kentucky hills, she couldn't know that her upcoming performance would set in motion events that would challenge everything Richard McAllister had built. The world of competitive horse breeding was about to collide with a story of unconditional love and determination, and nothing would ever be the same. The Rising Stars Youth Equestrian Showcase transformed the modest Lexington County Fairgrounds into a bustling hub of activity. Trailers of all sizes filled the parking area, and proud parents hurried about with garment bags and equipment. Among them, Rachel Carter helped Emma prepare Bright for their performance, both trying to calm their nervous energy. "Remember," Rachel said, adjusting Emma's borrowed show jacket, "no matter what happens today, you've already accomplished something amazing." Emma nodded, her hand steady as she braided small bells into Bright's mane. Not for show, but as part of their carefully choreographed routine. Each bell had a slightly different tone, creating a musical map that would guide Bright through their performance. In the VIP section of the stands, Richard McAllister sat with several potential investors, including the prestigious Wellington family from Virginia. He had been reluctant to attend what he considered a minor event, but the Wellingtons had specifically requested his presence. "Richard, have you heard about this blind horse everyone's talking about?" Margaret Wellington asked, consulting her program. "It says here the rider is just 12 years old. Can you imagine?" Richard's polite smile masked his disinterest. "Hey, blind horse has no place in competitive riding, Margaret. It's a novelty act at best." The announcer's voice boomed across the grounds. "Next in our junior showcase, please welcome Emma Carter and her horse, Bright." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Emma and Bright entered the arena. The horse's coat gleamed like polished silver in the summer sun, his movements precise despite his disability. Emma sat tall in the saddle, her face set with determination. The routine began simply enough, a walk that transformed into a collected trot. The audience watched at first with skepticism, then with growing amazement as Bright responded to Emma's subtle audio cues. The small bells in his mane created a gentle symphony with each movement. Richard leaned forward in his seat, something about the horse's conformation catching his eye. The arch of the neck, the set of the shoulders. There was something hauntingly familiar about this animal. Emma guided Bright through increasingly complex maneuvers. They had practiced countless hours for this moment, and it showed in their flawless communication. When they approached the first jump, a collective gasp went through the crowd. Surely they wouldn't attempt jumping with a blind horse. But Emma knew exactly what she was doing. She had spent months teaching Bright to gauge distances through sound and feel. The bells on the jump poles created distinct tones that told him exactly where to take off and land. As they cleared the first obstacle perfectly, scattered applause broke out. In the stands, Richard's face had gone pale. He recognized the horse now, the distinctive markings, the exceptional breeding visible in every line. This was Starlight Grace's foal, the one he had ordered abandoned. But instead of perishing in the forest, it had somehow found its way to this moment, defying every limitation he had placed upon it. Emma and Bright moved through their routine with growing confidence. Each successful movement seemed to energize them further, their bond visible to everyone watching. The skeptical whispers had turned to exclamations of amazement. When Bright performed a perfect collected canter around a complex set of obstacles, responding to Emma's voice commands with extraordinary precision, the audience burst into spontaneous applause. Margaret Wellington turned to Richard, her eyes shining. "This is extraordinary. The control, the trust between horse and rider. I've never seen anything like it." Richard barely heard her. His mind was racing, calculating the implications. This horse, this failure he had discarded, was now capturing the imagination of some of the most influential people in the industry. The irony was almost unbearable. As Emma and Bright completed their final sequence, the arena erupted in thunderous applause. Even the most hardened horse people in attendance were on their feet. Emma's face glowed with joy as she patted Bright's neck, leaning down to whisper words of praise that only he could hear. Dr. Martinez, watching from the sidelines, was already being approached by other trainers and veterinarians, all eager to learn more about the innovative training methods Emma had developed. The implications for working with disabled horses were revolutionary. Rachel stood at the arena gate, tears streaming down her face. She remembered the night Emma had brought Bright home, how impossible it had all seemed. Now her daughter had done what everyone said couldn't be done, and she had done it with grace and compassion. As Emma and Bright took their final bow, Richard McAllister made a decision. He couldn't allow this story to spread, couldn't risk the questions that would inevitably arise about the horse's origins. He would have to find a way to regain control of the situation, to protect everything he had built. What he didn't realize was that the story was already spreading, captured on dozens of phones and being shared across social media platforms. The blind horse and the young girl who believed in him were about to become something he couldn't control, a symbol of hope and perseverance that would challenge everything the equestrian world thought it knew about perfection. The days following the Rising Stars showcase were a whirlwind of attention. Local newspapers ran features about Emma and Bright, social media buzzed with videos of their performance, and the Carters' modest home received a steady stream of visitors, trainers, journalists, and curious horse enthusiasts, all eager to learn more about the remarkable blind horse and his young trainer. Richard McAllister watched it all unfold from his office at McAllister Stables, his jaw clenched, as he scrolled through yet another article praising the miracle horse. The story was spreading faster than he could control it, and worse, it was attracting attention from people whose opinions mattered in the industry. "Find out everything you can about the Carters," he instructed his assistant, "and get me an appointment with them. Make it clear that it's about a business opportunity they won't want to miss." Emma, meanwhile, was still floating on Cloud 9. Dr. Martinez had helped her document her training methods, and several prestigious equine therapy programs had expressed interest in implementing her techniques. The local feed store had even offered them a sponsorship deal, providing Bright's feed at cost in exchange for displaying their banner at future events. "Mom, look at this," Emma exclaimed one morning, showing Rachel an email on her tablet. "The State Agricultural College wants me to give a presentation about working with disabled horses. They say my methods could help other animals too." Rachel smiled, but her expression turned serious when she saw the official-looking car pulling into their driveway. A well-dressed woman stepped out, holding a leather portfolio. "Mrs. Carter," the woman called out, "I'm Patricia Wells, representing McAllister Stables. Mr. McAllister would like to schedule a meeting with you and your daughter regarding your horse." The name sent a chill down Rachel's spine. Everyone in Kentucky knew Richard McAllister, his wealth, his influence, and his reputation for getting what he wanted. She glanced at Emma, who had gone very still. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. Richard McAllister arrived precisely on time, his luxury car looking out of place next to the Carters' modest home. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his way, but there was something in his expression when he first saw Bright in the paddock, a flicker of something that might have been guilt, quickly masked by his professional smile. "Miss Carter," he addressed Emma directly, his tone carefully measured. "Your performance at the showcase was impressive. You've achieved something quite remarkable with this horse." He paused, studying Bright's familiar lines. "I'd like to make you an offer." Emma moved closer to Bright, her hand resting protectively on his neck. Rachel stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on her daughter's shoulder. "McAllister Stables has resources that could provide this horse with the best possible care," Richard continued. "State-of-the-art facilities, top veterinary care, professional training." He named a figure that made Rachel gasp, enough money to pay off their mortgage and send Emma to any college she chose. But Emma wasn't looking at Richard. She was watching Bright, who had become increasingly agitated as Richard spoke, his ears flicking back and forth, his nostrils flaring, as if remembering a scent from long ago. "No," Emma said quietly but firmly. "Bright isn't for sale." Richard's smile tightened. "Young lady, I don't think you understand what I'm offering. This is a chance to secure your future, to give this horse the kind of care most people can only dream of." "He already has everything he needs," Emma replied, her voice growing stronger. "He has love, understanding, and a purpose. Money can't buy that." Richard's facade cracked slightly, a flash of anger crossing his features. "Perhaps I should speak with your mother about this. Surely she understands the practical implications." "I understand perfectly," Rachel interrupted, her arm tightening around Emma's shoulders. "And I support my daughter's decision completely." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Richard looked from mother to daughter, then back to Bright, who stood calmly now, his blind eyes seeming to look right through the man who had once condemned him. "You're making a mistake," Richard said finally, his voice cold. "This offer won't remain open indefinitely." As he turned to leave, Emma called after him, "Mr. McAllister, you can't buy a miracle, and you can't erase one either." Richard froze for a moment, and Emma saw his shoulders tense. Without another word, he got into his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. What none of them knew was that Richard McAllister never took rejection well, and he had resources far beyond what the Carters could imagine. As his car disappeared down the country road, he was already formulating a new plan. If he couldn't buy what he wanted, he would find another way to get it. The story of Bright the blind horse had become a threat to everything he had built, and Richard McAllister had not become successful by allowing threats to persist. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the McAllister stables as Richard sat in his office, surrounded by legal documents. His team of lawyers had spent weeks building a case, searching for any angle that could give him leverage over the Carters. The newspaper headlines about the miracle blind horse had only increased, and with each passing day, Richard felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. "Sir," his assistant entered with a thick folder, "we've found something. The horse was never officially reported as abandoned, and there's no documentation of its transfer of ownership. Technically, it could still be considered McAllister Stables property." Richard's eyes gleamed as he reviewed the documents. It was the opening he had been waiting for. Within hours, his legal team had drafted the necessary paperwork, and by nightfall, the wheels were in motion. At the Carters' home, the day began like any other. Emma was in the barn with Bright, working on a new training technique she had developed. She had discovered that different ground textures could help him understand where he was in a space, and she was creating a sensory map of their practice area. The sound of car doors slamming interrupted their morning routine. Rachel appeared at the barn door, her face pale, holding an official-looking envelope. "Emma," she called, her voice trembling slightly, "come inside. We need to talk." The kitchen table was covered with papers, legal documents that seemed to grow more threatening with each page they turned. Richard McAllister was claiming ownership of Bright, citing breeding records and the lack of proper documentation of the horse's transfer. The lawsuit demanded immediate return of the animal to McAllister Stables. "But that's ridiculous," Emma exclaimed, her voice cracking with emotion. "He abandoned Bright. He left him to die in the forest." Rachel pulled her daughter close. "We'll fight this, Emma. We'll find a way." The local community rallied around them immediately. Dr. Martinez offered to testify about Bright's condition when Emma found him, and several neighbors came forward with statements about seeing the trailer that night in the forest. But Richard McAllister's legal team was relentless, filing motion after motion, each one draining the Carters' limited resources. Word of the legal battle spread through the equestrian community, drawing unexpected attention. Several animal rights organizations reached out, offering support and legal assistance. The story of the abandoned blind foal who became a beacon of hope touched hearts across the country. Back at McAllister Stables, not everyone was comfortable with Richard's actions. Ethan, the young stable hand who had been forced to abandon Bright that winter night, watched the situation unfold with growing unease. The guilt he had carried all these months weighed heavily on his conscience. Late one evening, as Emma sat in the barn with Bright, she heard footsteps approaching. A young man stood in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. "My name is Ethan," he said quietly. "I work at McAllister Stables, and I'm the one who left Bright in the forest that night." Emma's first instinct was anger, but something in Ethan's expression made her pause. He looked haunted, torn between loyalty to his employer and the need to right a wrong. "I was following orders," Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. McAllister, he ordered me to get rid of the foal. Said there was no place for imperfection in his stable. I've regretted it every day since." Emma watched as Bright turned toward Ethan's voice, his ears forward, remembering. The horse showed no sign of fear or distress, as if understanding that this man had been as much a victim of circumstances as he had been. "Will you help us?" Emma asked, hope rising in her chest. "Will you tell the truth about what happened?" Ethan nodded slowly. understanding that his decision would likely cost him his job and any future in the prestigious world of professional horse breeding. But watching Emma with Bright, seeing the miracle they had created together, he knew it was the right thing to do. "I'll testify," he said firmly. "I'll tell everyone exactly what Mr. McAllister did and why he did it." What they didn't know was that Richard McAllister had already anticipated this possibility. He had been watching Ethan closely, aware of the young man's growing discomfort. Even now, his legal team was preparing counter-arguments, ready to discredit any testimony that might threaten their case. The battle for Bright was becoming more than a simple question of ownership. It was evolving into a test of character, a challenge to the very values that defined the equestrian world. As Emma hugged Bright's neck that night, she couldn't know that their story was about to become a catalyst for change in ways none of them could have imagined. The courthouse in Lexington buzzed with activity as journalists and spectators gathered for what had become known as the Bright case. The story had captured national attention, pitting a powerful horse breeder against a 12-year-old girl and her blind horse. Local television crews set up their equipment outside, while inside, the tension was palpable. Emma sat between her mother and their pro bono lawyer, Sarah Thompson, who had taken their case after hearing about it on the news. Across the aisle, Richard McAllister's legal team filled an entire row, their expensive suits and confident demeanors a stark contrast to the Carter's modest appearance. "Remember," Sarah whispered to Emma, "just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." Richard McAllister sat stoically, his face betraying no emotion as his lead attorney presented their case. The argument seemed straightforward. McAllister Stables was the rightful owner of the horse, having bred and registered it. The attorney carefully avoided any mention of how Bright had ended up in the forest. "Your Honor," McAllister's lawyer concluded, "this is a simple matter of property rights. The horse in question is the product of years of careful breeding and significant investment by McAllister Stables. Its current possession by the Carter family is, at best, a case of finders keepers, which has no legal standing." Sarah Thompson stood next, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, this case is about far more than property rights. It's about responsibility, ethics, and the fundamental question of whether someone who deliberately abandons an animal can later claim ownership of that same animal after others have invested time, love, and resources into saving its life." The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, leaned forward. "Ms. Thompson, those are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support claims of deliberate abandonment?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have a witness who was directly involved in the events of that night." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Ethan was called to the stand. He walked forward slowly, his face pale but determined. Richard McAllister's expression darkened as he watched his former employee take the oath. "Mr. Walker," Sarah began, "please tell the court about the night of January 15th. Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he began his testimony. "Mr. McAllister called me to his office that morning. Starlight Grace, one of his best mares, had given birth to a foal that was blind. He told me to take the foal into the forest and leave it there." "Objection!" McAllister's lawyer stood sharply. "This is hearsay, Your Honor." "Overruled," the judge responded. "The witness is testifying to direct instructions he received. Continue, Mr. Walker." Ethan described that cold night in detail. The drive to the forest, the foal's trust as he led it from the trailer, the guilt that had haunted him ever since. As he spoke, Emma noticed several members of the jury wiping away tears. "Why did you decide to come forward now?" Sarah asked. Ethan looked directly at Emma and Bright, who stood quietly in a specially arranged area of the courtroom. "Because what they've done together is a miracle. They showed me that what I did that night was wrong, and that sometimes what we think of as weakness can become the greatest strength." Richard McAllister's lawyers attempted to discredit Ethan's testimony, suggesting he had been fired for incompetence and was seeking revenge. But Ethan remained steady, producing copies of text messages and maps that corroborated his story. Dr. Martinez testified next, presenting detailed records of Bright's condition when she first examined him and documentation of his remarkable progress under Emma's care. She explained to the court how Emma's innovative training methods were now being studied by veterinary schools and equine therapy programs. In my professional opinion, Dr. Martinez concluded, separating this horse from Emma Carter would be not only ethically wrong but potentially harmful to the animal's well-being. Their bond is extraordinary, and the progress they've made together is unprecedented in veterinary literature. As the day wore on, more witnesses came forward, neighbors who had helped care for Bright, experts who testified to the revolutionary nature of Emma's training techniques, even former employees of McAllister Stables who spoke about Richard's obsession with perfection. Throughout it all, Emma sat quietly, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch Bright's neck when he was near enough. The horse remained calm despite the unfamiliar environment, trusting in Emma's presence. Their connection was visible to everyone in the courtroom, a living testament to the power of love and determination over prejudice and pride. What no one could have predicted was how this case would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse, challenging long-held beliefs about perfection, value, and the true meaning of success in the equestrian world. As the first day of proceedings drew to a close, the story of Emma and Bright had already begun to inspire changes that would ripple through the industry for years to come. As the legal battle continued, the impact of Emma and Bright's story spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Social media was flooded with Sancha Bright's Fight hashtags, and equestrian forums buzzed with discussions about redefining perfection in the horse world. The case had touched a nerve, challenging long-held assumptions about what made a horse valuable. At McAllister Stables, the pressure was mounting. Several prominent clients had quietly withdrawn their horses, uncomfortable with the negative publicity surrounding the case. Richard McAllister's pristine reputation was showing cracks, and his board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. "This has gone too far, Richard," Margaret Wellington spoke up during the meeting. "The publicity is damaging not just to you but to everyone associated with McAllister Stables. That girl and her horse are becoming symbols of everything we've overlooked in our pursuit of perfection." Richard sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. "We can't back down now. It would be an admission of guilt." "Maybe that's exactly what we need," another board member suggested. "Times are changing. People want to see compassion, not just championships." Meanwhile, Emma's innovative training methods were gaining recognition in unexpected places. The State Agricultural University had sent a team to document her techniques, and rehabilitation centers were beginning to implement her sound-based training system with other disabled animals. Dr. Martinez had organized a special demonstration at her veterinary clinic where Emma showed how her methods could help other animals with visual impairments. The event attracted professionals from across the country, all eager to learn from a 12-year-old girl who had refused to see limitations where others saw only obstacles. "Watch how Bright responds to different sound patterns," Emma explained to the gathered crowd, demonstrating how the horse could navigate complex patterns using only audio cues. "Every animal has their own way of understanding the world. We just have to be willing to see it from their perspective." The media coverage of these demonstrations provided a stark contrast to the ongoing court case. While Richard McAllister's legal team argued about property rights and breeding registries, Emma and Bright were showing the world a different kind of victory, one measured not in ribbons and trophies, but in broken barriers and transformed lives. Rachel watched her daughter with pride, remembering the quiet, uncertain girl she had been before Bright came into their lives. The community's support had been overwhelming. Local businesses had set up a legal defense fund, and families drove from neighboring states just to watch Emma work with Bright. One afternoon, as Emma was demonstrating her training techniques to a group of veterinary students, an unexpected visitor arrived at the barn. It was Patricia Wells, Richard McAllister's longtime assistant. "I'm not here officially," she said quietly, watching Emma and Bright work together, "but I needed to see this for myself." Patricia had worked for McAllister Stables for over 2 decades, believing in their pursuit of perfection. But watching Emma and Bright, she saw something that all their championships and breeding programs had never achieved: pure joy in the connection between human and horse. Back in the courthouse, the case continued to unfold. McAllister's lawyers presented elaborate arguments about breeding rights and property law, but they couldn't counter the simple truth that emerged from witness after witness. A man had ordered a newborn foal abandoned in the forest, and a child had saved it, turning what he saw as worthless into something priceless. The story began appearing in educational materials, teaching children about empathy and perseverance. Animal welfare organizations used it to advocate for changes in breeding regulations. Even some of McAllister's closest business associates were quietly distancing themselves, recognizing that the public's perception of excellence in horse breeding was shifting. Emma remained focused on Bright, spending every free moment developing new training techniques. She had started working with other disabled animals at Dr. Martinez's clinic, applying what she had learned with Bright to help other creatures that others had given up on. "You know what I've learned?" she told a reporter who asked about the court case. "Sometimes the things that make us different are actually our greatest gifts. Bright taught me that. He sees the world in his own way, and because of that, he's helped us all see it differently too." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The horse that Richard McAllister had discarded as worthless had become a catalyst for change in the very industry he had dominated for so long. As the case drew international attention, it became clear that regardless of the legal outcome, the impact of Emma and Bright's story would continue to reshape perspectives about value, ability, and the true meaning of perfection. The final days of the trial brought record crowds to the Lexington courthouse. The gallery was packed with spectators, many wearing blue ribbons, the color that had become a symbol of support for Emma and Bright. Outside, television crews jockeyed for position, their satellite trucks filling the parking lot. Inside the courtroom, Richard McAllister's legal team made their final push. They brought in experts to testify about the value of purebred bloodlines and the investments made in breeding programs. Their argument was clinical, focused entirely on monetary worth and legal ownership. "Your Honor," McAllister's lead attorney argued, "this case isn't about emotion. It's about protecting the interests of legitimate breeding operations. If we allow finders to claim ownership of valuable bloodstock, it sets a dangerous precedent for the entire industry." Sarah Thompson, the Carters' lawyer, took a different approach. Instead of competing with McAllister's experts on technical grounds, she focused on the transformation that had occurred since Emma found Bright. "I'd like to call one final witness," she announced. Dr. Rebecca Chen, director of the International Equine Therapy Association. Dr. Chen, a distinguished researcher with decades of experience, took the stand. She described how Emma's innovative training methods were being implemented in therapy programs worldwide. "What this young girl has accomplished is revolutionary," Dr. Chen testified. "Her work with Bright has opened new possibilities for disabled animals everywhere. We've already seen successful applications of her methods in therapy programs across 3 continents." The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "Can you be more specific about the impact?" Dr. Chen smiled. "Last month, a rehabilitation center in California used Emma's Bell training technique to help a therapy horse that had lost its sight due to injury. They're now working with veterans suffering from PTSD. In Australia, a wildlife sanctuary has adapted her methods to help rehabilitate injured animals. This isn't just about one horse anymore. It's about changing how we view and value all living beings." During a brief recess, Emma sat with Bright in the courthouse's small garden area, specially arranged to accommodate him during the trial. The horse's ears pricked forward at the sound of approaching footsteps. It was Margaret Wellington, one of McAllister's most influential board members. "May I?" Margaret gestured to the space next to Emma. Emma nodded, watching as Margaret observed Bright's calm demeanor despite the bustling courthouse environment. "You know," Margaret began, "I've been in the horse business for 40 years. I've seen champions born and made, but I've never seen anything quite like this." She reached out tentatively, and Bright gently nuzzled her hand. "How do you explain to him where things are?" Emma demonstrated her system of verbal cues and sound markers, showing how Bright could navigate complex spaces with confidence. Margaret watched in amazement as the horse responded to subtle audio signals, moving with grace and precision. "Perfect isn't always what we think it is it?" Margaret mused, more to herself than to Emma. Back in session, Sarah Thompson delivered her closing argument. She didn't focus on legal precedents or property rights. Instead, she told a story about a child who saw possibility where others saw limitation, about a horse that proved that value couldn't be measured in traditional terms. "Your Honor," she concluded, "we're not just deciding the fate of one horse. We're deciding what kind of industry we want to be. Do we measure worth solely in terms of bloodlines and competition records? Or do we recognize that sometimes the greatest contributions to our field come from unexpected sources?" As the courtroom waited for the judge's decision, the impact of the case was already rippling through the equestrian world. Training programs were being reevaluated, and breeders were beginning to question long-held assumptions about what made a horse valuable. In the gallery, Dr. Martinez sat with a thick folder of documentation, requests from veterinary schools wanting to incorporate Emma's methods into their curriculum, letters from therapy programs reporting successful adaptations of her techniques, and preliminary research data showing the broader applications of her work. Richard McAllister sat at his table, outwardly composed but inwardly shaken. He had built his empire on a singular vision of perfection, but watching Emma with Bright had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most valuable things were the ones that couldn't be measured by traditional standards. The judge's gavel brought the courtroom to attention. As she prepared to deliver her verdict, no one could deny that regardless of the legal outcome, Emma and Bright had already won a more important victory. They had changed hearts and minds, proving that true value lies not in physical perfection, but in the capacity to inspire and transform. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Eleanor Matthews adjusted her reading glasses. Years of experience had taught her that some cases transcended mere legal precedent, and this was certainly one of them. The silence was absolute as she began to speak. In the case of McAllister Stables versus Carter, this court has been presented with a complex issue that goes beyond simple property rights. We must consider not only the letter of the law, but its spirit and the broader implications of our decision. Emma sat perfectly still, one hand clutching her mother's, the other resting on Bright's neck. The horse stood calmly beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions swirling through the courtroom. The plaintiff, McAllister Stables, has presented evidence of their original ownership and breeding rights. However, the manner in which these rights were effectively abandoned cannot be ignored. Mr. McAllister's deliberate decision to discard the animal, as testified to by multiple witnesses, constitutes a clear relinquishment of those rights. Richard McAllister's jaw tightened, but he remained stoically silent. His legal team shuffled papers nervously, already preparing for a possible appeal. Furthermore, the judge continued, the extraordinary circumstances of this case must be considered. The defendant, Emma Carter, didn't simply find and keep a stray animal. She rescued, rehabilitated, and developed innovative methods to train a horse that others had deemed worthless. In doing so, she has contributed significantly to the field of equine therapy and rehabilitation. Dr. Martinez nodded quietly from her seat, thinking of all the other animals that were already benefiting from Emma's methods. The court also cannot ignore the broader impact this case has had on the equestrian community. The testimony we've heard from experts in the field suggests that Miss Carter's work with Bright has opened new possibilities for disabled animals and therapeutic programs worldwide. The judge paused, looking directly at Emma. Young lady, your dedication and innovative spirit have turned what some saw as a liability into an asset not just for yourself, but for the entire equestrian community. Rachel squeezed Emma's hand tighter as they waited for the final ruling. Therefore, it is the finding of this court that the abandoned animal effectively entered the public domain, and subsequent rehabilitation and care by the Carter family establishes their legal right of ownership. The plaintiff's claim is hereby dismissed. The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Furthermore, she added, this court recommends that the State Equestrian Association review its policies regarding the treatment and disposal of animals with disabilities. As the judge's words settled over the courtroom, Emma buried her face in Bright's mane, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. Rachel wrapped her arms around both her daughter and the horse, forming a tableau that photographers would capture for the next day's headlines. Richard McAllister stood abruptly, buttoning his jacket with hands that trembled slightly. The empire he had built on the pursuit of perfection suddenly seemed hollow in the face of what this young girl had accomplished with a horse he had discarded. Margaret Wellington approached him as he prepared to leave. "Richard," she said quietly, "sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to unexpected blessings. Perhaps it's time to consider a different definition of excellence." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to await the verdict. When Emma emerged with Bright, the cheers were deafening. Local horse owners had brought their animals to show support, creating an impromptu parade ground on the courthouse lawn. Dr. Martinez made her way through the crowd to Emma's side. "This is just the beginning," she said, smiling broadly. "We've already received inquiries from rehabilitation centers across the country. Your methods could help thousands of animals." Ethan, who had risked everything to testify, stood quietly at the edge of the celebration. When Emma spotted him, she waved him over. "We couldn't have done this without you," she said simply. As reporters clamored for interviews and well-wishers pressed forward with congratulations, Emma remained focused on Bright. The horse's ears swiveled calmly, taking in the sounds of celebration around them. In that moment, it was clear to everyone present that true victory wasn't measured in legal terms, but in the unshakable bond between a girl and her horse. The story of Emma and Bright was about to enter a new chapter, one that would challenge the equestrian world to re-examine its values and open its doors to possibilities that had once seemed impossible. As the autumn sun set over the Kentucky courthouse, casting long shadows across the gathering, it was clear that this verdict wasn't just about the ownership of one horse. It was about transforming the very heart of an industry. In the weeks following the verdict, the equestrian world began to transform in ways no one could have predicted. The story of Emma and Bright had sparked a movement, challenging long-held beliefs about what made a horse valuable. At the center of it all, Emma continued her work, unaware that she had become a catalyst for change throughout the industry. The State Agricultural University had converted one of its training facilities into a research center dedicated to adaptive riding techniques. Dr. Martinez headed the program with Emma and Bright as regular consultants. The sight of a 12-year-old girl teaching veteran trainers and researchers had become surprisingly normal. "The key is to understand that every horse communicates differently," Emma explained to a group of veterinary students one morning. Bright stood beside her, demonstrating their unique system of audio cues. "We just have to learn their language instead of forcing them to learn ours." Rachel watched from the sidelines, remembering the night Emma had brought home a frightened, blind foal. Now that same horse was helping to revolutionize equine therapy. The financial struggles that had once seemed overwhelming had eased as organizations offered grants to support their work. At McAllister Stables, changes were also taking place. Richard McAllister had been notably absent from public view since the trial, but his board of directors had been busy. Margaret Wellington had taken charge of implementing new policies, starting with a comprehensive review of their breeding program. "We need to evolve," she announced at a press conference. "The success of Emma and Bright has shown us that our definition of excellence needs to expand." The announcement that McAllister Stables would be establishing a division dedicated to special needs horses sent shockwaves through the industry. Ethan had found his own path forward. Rather than facing unemployment, he had been approached by several rehabilitation centers eager to benefit from his experience. He chose to work with a program that helped veterans with PTSD connect with horses, finding redemption in helping others heal. The local community that had rallied around Emma and Bright continued to grow. The old Johnson barn had been renovated through volunteer efforts, transformed into a small but well-equipped training facility. Every weekend, families brought children with various disabilities to work with Emma and Bright, witnessing firsthand the power of unconditional acceptance. One crisp autumn morning, as Emma worked with a young girl who was learning to ride despite being hearing impaired, an unexpected visitor arrived at the barn. Patricia Wells, Richard McAllister's former assistant, stood watching the session with tears in her eyes. "He wants to see you," Patricia said quietly after the lesson ended. "Richard, he's changed, Emma. Your story, what you've accomplished, it's made him question everything." Emma exchanged glances with her mother, who had come to stand protectively beside her. "What does he want?" "To apologize," Patricia replied, "and to learn." The request sparked intense discussion among Emma's supporters. Some feared it was another legal trick, but Emma saw it differently. "Bright taught me that everyone deserves a second chance," she said simply. "Even Mr. McAllister." The meeting was arranged for the following week. The autumn sun painted the countryside in gold as Richard McAllister's car pulled up to the renovated barn. He stepped out looking older and somehow smaller than Emma remembered from the courtroom. Bright's ears pricked forward at the sound of approaching footsteps, but he showed no sign of distress. Emma had worked with him to associate different gaits and walking patterns with different people, and something in Richard's hesitant step must have registered as non-threatening. "Miss Carter," Richard began formally, then stopped, his carefully prepared speech forgotten as he watched Bright move confidently through the training area, responding to subtle audio cues that would have seemed like magic just months ago. "Would you like to learn how it works?" Emma offered, holding out a training bell. The man who had once declared there was no room for imperfection in his stables stood silent for a moment. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, he accepted the bell. As Emma began to explain their training system, she demonstrated how Bright had learned to trust his other senses, how his supposed disability had led to the development of abilities that amazed even experienced trainers. Richard listened intently, his expression softening as he witnessed firsthand the miracle he had once discarded. The session marked the beginning of another unexpected chapter in their story. The man who had tried to erase Bright's existence was now learning to see the world through new eyes, guided by the very horse he had condemned and the child who had saved it. The transformation of Richard McAllister became a story almost as compelling as Emma and Bright's original journey. The man who had once defined success solely through ribbons and trophies now spent his mornings at Emma's training facility, learning a new way of seeing the world through Bright's example. "I've been thinking," Richard said one morning, watching Emma work with a newly arrived blind pony, "about all the potential we might have missed over the years. How many other Brights did we overlook because they didn't fit our narrow definition of perfect?" Emma guided the pony through a series of gentle exercises using the techniques she had developed with Bright. "Every animal has something to teach us," she replied, "if we're willing to learn." The change in Richard wasn't just philosophical. He had begun implementing radical changes at McAllister Stables, starting with the establishment of a dedicated rehabilitation wing. The facility that had once turned away any horse with imperfections was now becoming a leader in adaptive training techniques. Margaret Wellington had fully supported the transformation, helping to reshape the stable's image in the equestrian community. "Richard," she remarked during a board meeting, "what you once saw as your greatest failure has become your greatest opportunity for redemption." The impact rippled through the industry. Other prestigious stables began following McAllister's lead, establishing programs for horses with special needs. The emphasis on perfect bloodlines and flawless conformation began to shift toward a more holistic view of what made a horse valuable. Emma's influence continued to grow, but she remained focused on the day-to-day work with the animals. Her methods had evolved, incorporating new insights gained from each horse she worked with. Bright remained her partner and teacher, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. One particularly meaningful moment came when Richard brought Starlight Grace, Bright's mother, to visit. The mare had been retired from breeding, and Richard thought it was time for a reunion. The moment Bright heard his mother's distinctive whinny, his ears pricked forward in recognition. "Some bonds can't be broken," Emma observed, watching mother and son reconnect. "They just need a chance to grow." Rachel, watching from the sidelines, saw tears in Richard's eyes as he witnessed the reunion. The man who had once ordered Bright abandoned now stood in awe of the connection between the horses, understanding finally that true value couldn't be measured in traditional terms. The local community had embraced the changes as well. The training facility had become a gathering place for families, therapists, and trainers from around the world. Emma's innovative methods were being adapted for use with other animals, and even in human therapy programs. Dr. Martinez had documented everything meticulously, publishing papers that were revolutionizing the field of equine therapy. "What started with one blind foal," she told a conference of veterinarians, "has grown into a movement that's changing how we think about ability and disability in all animals." Richard's presence at the facility had initially caused some tension, but as weeks passed, people began to see the genuine nature of his transformation. He worked tirelessly to make amends, not just through words, but through actions that demonstrated his commitment to change. "You know," he told Emma one afternoon, "I spent my entire life pursuing perfection, never realizing that perfection isn't about flawlessness. It's about reaching your full potential, whatever that might be." The autumn air was crisp as they watched Bright guide a newly arrived blind horse through the training area, demonstrating a confidence that seemed impossible for an animal that couldn't see. The bells that Emma had first used to train Bright now created a symphony of hope throughout the facility. Emma's methods continued to evolve, incorporating new insights and adaptations. She worked closely with Richard to document everything, creating training manuals that would help others implement similar programs. The girl who had once simply wanted to save a blind foal was now helping to reshape the entire approach to animal rehabilitation. As the sun set over the Kentucky hills, casting long shadows across the training grounds, Richard watched Emma work with Bright. The horse moved with perfect trust, responding to subtle cues that most people wouldn't even notice. In that moment, he understood that true legacy isn't built on trophies and championships, but on the lives you touch and the changes you inspire. The winter snow blanketed the Kentucky countryside, but inside Emma's training facility, the atmosphere was warm with activity. The once modest barn had evolved into a center of innovation, attracting visitors from around the world. Today, a group of researchers from an international animal rehabilitation institute had come to observe Emma's methods. "It's remarkable," Dr. B. Sarah Chen, the lead researcher, commented as she watched Emma work with Bright. "The applications of your sound-based training system go far beyond horses. We're seeing success with similar methods in wildlife rehabilitation centers across Asia." Emma guided Bright through a complex sequence of movements, their communication so subtle it seemed almost telepathic. The horse's confidence had only grown stronger over time, and he now helped train other animals, demonstrating an almost intuitive understanding of their needs. Richard McAllister, who had become a regular presence at the facility, stood nearby, taking notes. His transformation from skeptic to advocate had become legendary in the equestrian community. McAllister Stables, once known only for its championship bloodlines, was now equally famous for its innovative rehabilitation programs. "We've completely redesigned our breeding program," Richard explained to the visiting researchers. "Instead of discarding animals with challenges, we're learning to understand and work with their unique abilities." Emma and Bright showed us that what we once saw as limitations often hold unexpected potential. The impact of their work had spread far beyond the equestrian world. Rehabilitation centers for all types of animals had begun adopting variations of Emma's methods. A marine mammal rescue center in Florida had successfully adapted her sound-based navigation system for blind dolphins. A big cat sanctuary in California was using similar techniques with visually impaired tigers. Rachel watched her daughter with pride, remembering the night Emma had brought home a frightened blind foal. Now, that act of compassion had sparked a movement that was changing lives across species. The financial struggles that had once seemed overwhelming were a distant memory, replaced by grants and support from organizations eager to learn from their success. "Mom," Emma called excitedly, "watch this." She demonstrated a new training technique she had developed, using different textured surfaces to help animals build confidence in their movements. Bright moved seamlessly across the varying surfaces, showing how well the method worked. Dr. Martinez, who had been documenting everything from the beginning, was preparing to publish a comprehensive guide to Emma's methods. "What you've created here," she told Emma, "is going to help animals for generations to come." The facility had become a place of healing, not just for animals, but for people too. Veterans with PTSD found peace working with the horses, and children with disabilities discovered new confidence through adaptive riding programs. Emma's innovative approach to working with limitations, rather than against them, had created a model for therapeutic programs worldwide. Ethan, who had once feared his career was over after testifying against Richard, now ran the facility's training program for new staff. His experience had given him a unique perspective on the importance of standing up for what's right, and he shared that wisdom with every new trainer who came through the program. "You know what I've learned?" he told a group of trainees. "Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from what we think are our biggest challenges. Every animal that comes through here teaches us something new. The afternoon light filtered through the barn windows as Emma worked with a newly arrived horse, another blind foal that a breeder had been about to give up on. Bright stood nearby, his presence seeming to calm the nervous newcomer. The bells that had once been a simple training tool now created a symphony throughout the facility, each chime representing another step toward understanding. Margaret Wellington, who had become one of the facility's strongest supporters, observed the session with satisfaction. "When I think about how close we came to losing all of this," she mused to Richard, "it reminds me that sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our greatest achievements." As the day drew to a close, Emma sat with Bright in their favorite quiet corner of the facility. The horse's head rested gently against her shoulder, their bond as strong as ever. Around them, the sound of bells, voices, and happy animals created a melody of hope and possibility. What had started as one girl's determination to save one horse had grown into something that was changing the very nature of animal rehabilitation. The world was beginning to understand what Emma had known all along, that sometimes the things that make us different are the very things that make us extraordinary. Spring had returned to Kentucky, and with it came a special celebration at Emma's training facility. 1 year had passed since the courthouse verdict that had changed everything. The once modest barn had been transformed into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center, while still maintaining its warm, welcoming atmosphere. Today, the facility was hosting its first international symposium on adaptive animal training. Representatives from rehabilitation centers worldwide had gathered to learn and share experiences. Emma, now 13, stood at the center of it all, her quiet confidence a testament to how much she had grown. "Welcome, everyone," she addressed the gathered crowd, Bright standing proudly beside her. "A year ago, people said a blind horse couldn't have a purpose. Today we're going to show you how every animal, regardless of their challenges, has something extraordinary to offer." Richard McAllister sat in the front row, a very different man from the one who had once ordered Bright's abandonment. His presence at the symposium was particularly meaningful. McAllister Stables had become a leading voice in promoting adaptive training methods throughout the industry. "I used to think I knew everything about horses," Richard shared with the audience during his presentation. "But it took a 12-year-old girl and a blind horse to show me how much I had to learn. They taught me that true value isn't measured in ribbons or trophies, but in the ability to transform lives." The day's demonstrations included success stories from around the world. A team from Japan showed videos of their work with blind cattle using Emma's bell system. Australian wildlife rehabilitators shared how they had adapted her methods for injured kangaroos. Each presentation reinforced how far the ripples of Emma and Bright's influence had spread. Dr. Martinez unveiled the official launch of the International Adaptive Animal Training Institute, a partnership between the State Agricultural University and rehabilitation centers worldwide. The institute would serve as a research hub and training center, ensuring that Emma's methods would continue to evolve and benefit animals everywhere. But none of this would exist, Dr. Martinez emphasized, without the courage of a young girl who saw possibility where others saw limitation, and the trust of a horse who proved that disability doesn't mean inability. During the afternoon sessions, Emma worked with Bright to demonstrate their latest innovations. The horse moved through complex patterns with perfect precision, responding to subtle audio and tactile cues that they had refined over months of working together. The audience watched in amazement as Bright helped guide a newly blind horse through the training course, showing an almost mentorship-like capability. Rachel, watching from the sidelines, remembered the financial struggles and uncertainty of their early days. Now the facility was self-sustaining, supported by grants and donations from organizations impressed by their groundbreaking work. More importantly, it had remained true to its original mission, helping animals that others had given up on. Margaret Wellington approached Emma during a break between sessions. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I first heard about a blind horse performing in public, I thought it was a gimmick. Now I understand it was never about the performance. It was about showing us all a better way forward." The day's events concluded with a special ceremony honoring the first graduating class of certified adaptive animal trainers. These professionals would take Emma's methods back to their own facilities, spreading the impact of her work even further. Ethan, who had helped develop the training curriculum, presented the certificates. As the sun set over the Kentucky hills, Emma took a quiet moment with Bright in their favorite corner of the facility. The horse's coat gleamed in the fading light, and his ears pricked forward at the sound of approaching footsteps, Richard McAllister's distinctive gait. "Emma," he said softly, "I've been thinking about legacy lately. For years I thought my legacy would be about breeding champions. Instead, my greatest contribution to the horse world came through my biggest mistake, the day I ordered Bright to be abandoned." Emma stroked Bright's neck, listening. "You didn't just save a horse that day," Richard continued. "You started a movement that's changing how we define value in all living beings. That's a legacy worth more than all the trophies in the world." Around them, the facility hummed with activity as participants from the symposium discussed the day's events, their excited conversations mixing with the gentle chiming of training bells. Each sound represented another step toward a future where limitations were seen not as endpoints, but as beginnings of new possibilities. A gentle summer breeze carried the sound of bells across the expanded grounds of the International Adaptive Animal Training Center, once simply known as Emma's Barn. The facility had grown, but its heart remained the same, a place where limitations transformed into possibilities. Emma, now preparing for her 14th birthday, stood at the center of the main training arena, surrounded by a new generation of students eager to learn her methods. Bright, his silver coat gleaming in the morning sun, demonstrated with the grace of a seasoned teacher how to guide other animals through their challenges. "The most important thing to remember," Emma explained to her attentive audience, "is that every animal has their own way of seeing the world. Our job isn't to force them to adapt to our way, but to understand and work with theirs." Richard McAllister, who had become a regular fixture at the center, nodded in agreement from his spot near the arena gate. His own facility had undergone a complete transformation, becoming a sister location focused on rehabilitation and adaptive training. The man who had once defined success through perfection now found his greatest joy in helping animals overcome their challenges. "You know," he addressed the gathering, "someone very wise once told me that perfect isn't always what we think it is. Sometimes, what we perceive as flaws become our greatest strengths." The center had become a beacon of hope for animals and humans alike. Every week brought new stories of success: a therapy horse helping veterans heal, a blind dog learning to navigate through sound, even a dolphin using adaptive techniques to overcome its injuries. Each success traced its roots back to that snowy night when a young girl refused to see limitations where others saw only obstacles. Dr. Martinez, reviewing the latest research data, marveled at how far they'd come. "The ripple effect is extraordinary," she told Rachel. "Centers across 5 continents are now using variations of Emma's methods. We are seeing breakthrough results not just with horses, but with all kinds of animals previously considered beyond help." As the day's training session concluded, Emma took a moment to reflect with Bright in their special corner of the facility. The same bells that had once guided a frightened foal through darkness now created a symphony of hope throughout the grounds. Each chime represented another barrier broken, another life transformed. Margaret Wellington, who had become one of the center's strongest advocates, approached them with news. "The International Equestrian Federation has officially changed its policies," she announced. "They're introducing new categories for adaptive competition, and they want you and Bright to help develop the guidelines." Emma smiled, remembering how far they'd come from the days when people laughed at the idea of a blind horse competing. Now, those same people were asking for their guidance in reshaping the industry's approach to animals with special needs. The sunset painted the Kentucky sky in brilliant colors as the day's activities wound down. Families gathered for the evening's special event, a demonstration of how far their work had spread. Through video links, rehabilitation centers worldwide shared their success stories, each one a branch growing from the seed planted by a girl's compassion and a horse's courage. Ethan, standing with the newest group of trainers he'd certified, summed it up perfectly. "Every day we see the impossible become possible, and it all started because one person chose to see ability where others saw only disability." As the evening concluded, Emma stood before the gathered crowd, Bright by her side as always. "Our story isn't just about a girl and her horse," she said. "It's about the power of believing in something beyond what others can see. It's about understanding that every being has value, has purpose, has the capacity to change lives. Around them, the center buzzed with activity, new trainers learning the methods, animals discovering their potential, and families finding hope they thought they'd lost. The legacy of Emma and Bright had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined on that cold winter night when their paths first crossed. "And so," Emma continued, her voice carrying across the now quiet arena, "we invite you to be part of this continuing journey. Every day brings new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. Whether you're here in person or watching from afar, you're part of this story now." The gentle sound of bells echoed through the gathering dusk, a reminder of how the simplest solutions often lead to the most profound changes. As the stars began to appear in the Kentucky sky, each one seemed to mirror the countless lives touched by a story that began with a single act of compassion. Dear listeners, Emma and Bright's journey reminds us that the most powerful stories are those that change how we see the world. If their tale has touched your heart, we invite you to be part of our growing community. Subscribe to our channel to discover more inspiring stories of transformation and hope. Leave a like if you believe in the power of second chances, and share your own stories of overcoming challenges in the comments below. Remember, every new day brings the opportunity to make a difference, just as Emma and Bright continue to do. Join us tomorrow for another extraordinary story that proves that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from seeing the world through different eyes.